The courtroom was suffocatingly quiet, save for the occasional rustle of papers or the shifting of chairs. My eyes were fixed on Emily, her small frame barely filling the oversized chair beside her grandmother, Margaret Lawson. She sat still, her head slightly bowed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. It didn't sit right with me. None of this did. Judge Catherine Stone's voice cut through the heavy silence like a blade. After careful review, this court grants custody of Emily Walker to her biological father, Andrew Walker. The sound of the gavel rang out, and the gallery erupted into hushed murmurs. I felt my chest tighten, a pang of anger bubbling beneath my calm exterior. Andrew Walker, an absentee father who had spent more time dodging responsibilities than caring for his daughter, was walking out of here with full custody. Margaret shot to her feet, her face flushed with desperation. "You can't do this," she yelled, her voice trembling. "He doesn't deserve her. He doesn't know her." "Ms. Lawson, please sit down," Judge Stone said sharply. But Margaret didn't budge. "Ask her. Ask Emily what she wants," she cried. "She's old enough to tell you herself." I glanced at Andrew, who was shifting in his seat, his face a mask of irritation. He wasn't even trying to hide his disdain for Margaret or his indifference toward Emily. Judge Stone's gaze fell to Emily, who hadn't moved a muscle. Her hands were folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. "Emily," the judge said softly, her tone noticeably gentler. "Would you like to say something? You don't have to if you don't want to, but this is your chance to speak." Emily's small shoulders rose and fell as she took a deep breath. Slowly she nodded. "Come forward, please," the judge instructed. The bailiff helped Emily out of her chair, and she walked toward the front of the courtroom with measured, hesitant steps. She climbed into the witness chair, her feet dangling above the floor, and folded her hands in her lap once more. "You're very brave for coming up here," Judge Stone said. "Take your time." The room seemed to hold its collective breath as Emily opened her mouth to speak. "I don't want to go with him," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. Her words hit like a thunderclap. The gallery erupted into whispers, and I could feel the tension spike in the air. Margaret gasped audibly, covering her mouth with her hand. Andrew leaned forward, glaring at Emily. His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he was going to lash out. "Emily," Judge Stone said gently, "can you tell us why you don't want to go with your father?" Emily hesitated, glancing at Margaret, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. Because he's scary," she said, her voice trembling. The room fell silent again. I felt a knot form in my stomach, and I clenched my fists under the table. Andrew shot up from his chair, his voice booming. "This is ridiculous. She's a child. She doesn't know what she's talking about." "Mr. Walker, sit down," Judge Stone said firmly. Andrew hesitated, his face red with anger, but eventually he sank back into his chair, muttering under his breath. "Emily," the judge continued, her tone steady, "can you tell us what you mean by scary? Did something happen?" Emily's small hands twisted the hem of her dress, her fingers trembling. "He used to come to our house," she said, her voice wavering. "When Mommy was alive." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "He would yell at her," Emily continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Really loud. Mommy would tell me to stay in my room, but I could hear him." Margaret began to cry softly, her shoulders shaking as she tried to hold it in. Emily took another shaky breath. "One night he came late. Mommy told me to hide in my room, but I was scared, so I stayed by the door. I heard him yelling at her. He was really mad. Then I heard something break, and Mommy screamed." Her voice cracked, and tears slid down her cheeks. Judge Stone leaned forward slightly. "You're doing very well, Emily," she said. "What happened after that?" Emily wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "He left," she said. "But Mommy was crying, and her face was bleeding. She told me not to tell anyone. She said everything would be okay." Andrew clenched his fists, his face a mask of rage. "This is absurd," he shouted. "She's lying. She's just a kid. She doesn't understand. Mr. Walker, if you speak out of turn again, I will hold you in contempt of court," the judge warned, her tone icy. Emily flinched at his outburst, her small frame trembling. "Emily," Judge Stone said softly, Is there anything else you want to tell us? Take your time. For a moment, Emily didn't say anything. Her hands were shaking, her gaze fixed on the microphone in front of her. Then, in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, she said, "He told Mommy he told her if she ever told anyone, he would hurt me too." The words sent a chill through the room. Even the whispers stopped, leaving only the sound of Emily's quiet sniffles. I sat there, my hands gripping the edge of the table, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't just a custody case anymore, it was something much darker. And it wasn't over yet. The silence in the courtroom was deafening after Emily's words. I could see Judge Stone struggling to maintain her composure. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. Emily's quiet, trembling voice hung heavy in the air, and the reality of what she had just said was like a storm rolling in, ready to swallow us all. Margaret was crying softly, her face buried in her hands. Andrew sat rigid in his chair, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists on the table. I could feel his anger radiating across the room. But beneath that, there was something else, a flicker of fear. "Emily," Judge Stone finally said, her voice calm but firm, "are you saying that your father threatened your mother? And you?" Emily nodded slowly, her little hands clutching the edge of the witness chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "He said he would hurt her," Emily whispered. "And me too, if we told anyone." Andrew shot to his feet again, his voice booming. "This is insane. She's lying. She's just a kid who doesn't understand what she's saying." "Mr. Walker," Judge Stone's voice cracked like a whip. "Sit down. Now." Andrew glared at the judge, but obeyed, slamming himself back into his chair with a huff. His lawyer leaned over, whispering something to him, but Andrew waved him off impatiently. The judge turned back to Emily, her expression softening. "Emily, I know this is very hard for you, and you're being very brave. Can you tell us if anything else happened? It's okay if you need a moment." Emily took a shaky breath, her eyes darting toward Margaret as if seeking reassurance. Margaret nodded, her tears streaming silently down her cheeks. "It was the last time I saw him," Emily said after a moment. Her voice was so quiet that the court reporter leaned forward to catch her words. "After that night, Mommy told him he couldn't come back anymore. She said she was going to keep me safe." The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. Emily's gaze dropped to her lap. "But then Mommy got really sad," she said, her voice trembling. "She stopped laughing, and she didn't play with me as much. And one day, she didn't wake up." Margaret let out a quiet sob, and I felt my stomach twist into knots. The tragedy was unfolding right in front of us, and yet it felt as though we were powerless to stop it. Judge Stone leaned forward. "Emily, can you tell us what happened when your mother didn't wake up?" Emily sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "Grandma came to get me," she said. "She said Mommy was gone, that she was in heaven now." Her words were simple, the kind of explanation an adult gives a child to shield them from the worst of the truth. But the raw pain in her voice was unmistakable. Margaret stood abruptly, unable to contain herself any longer. "Your Honor," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "Emily has been through enough. She doesn't deserve to be dragged into his life, not after everything he's done. Please, for her sake, reconsider your ruling." "Ms. Lawson, I understand your concerns," Judge Stone said, her tone measured but stern. "But allegations like these require evidence. I can't make a decision based solely on testimony, especially from a child." "She's not lying," Margaret shouted, her desperation breaking through. "You can see it in her face. She's terrified of him." Andrew scoffed loudly, leaning back in his chair. "She's just filling her head with stories to turn her against me," he muttered. "This is exactly why I'm fighting for custody. The kid deserves a better life than the garbage she's been fed." Margaret whirled on him, her eyes blazing. "A better life? From you? You think Emily's forgotten what you've done? You think I have? You don't deserve to be anywhere near her." "Enough!" Judge Stone raised her hand, silencing them both. "This is a courtroom, not a battleground. If either of you disrupts the proceedings again, I'll hold you in contempt." The tension in the room was palpable, and I could feel the eyes of every spectator fixed on the small figure in the witness chair. Emily hadn't moved, her head bowed, her little hands still clutching the armrests. Emily, the judge said gently, is there anything else you want to tell us? It's okay if there's not, but if there's something you think we should know, now is the time to say it. For a moment, it seemed like Emily wouldn't answer. She sat perfectly still, her breathing shallow. Then, slowly, she lifted her head. There's one more thing, she said softly. The room fell so silent that even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. Emily's gaze shifted toward Andrew, and her small voice carried a weight that felt far too heavy for someone her age. He said if I ever told anyone, he'd come back for me. Andrew slammed his hands on the table, rising to his feet. That's enough, he bellowed. This is a setup. She's been coached to say all of this. Bailiff! Judge Stone snapped, and two officers stepped forward immediately, positioning themselves on either side of Andrew. Sit down, Mr. Walker, one of them said, his voice low and firm. Andrew glared at them, but reluctantly sat, his body tense and vibrating with barely contained rage. Judge Stone turned back to Emily, her face unreadable. Emily, she said, I want you to know that you're safe here. No one is going to hurt you. Do you understand that? Emily nodded, but the fear in her eyes didn't fade. The judge sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. We'll take a short recess, she announced, her gavel striking the wood with finality. The courtroom erupted into murmurs as people filed out, but I stayed in my seat, my mind racing. Andrew's reaction to Emily's words had been too visceral, too defensive. He was hiding something, I was sure of it. Whatever it was, Emily's testimony had cracked something open, and I could feel the truth just below the surface, waiting to come to light. The courtroom had emptied during the recess, leaving behind an oppressive silence. The echoes of Emily's testimony still lingered in my mind, her trembling voice, her quiet fear as she revealed Andrew's threats. I couldn't shake the look in her eyes when she glanced at him. That kind of fear didn't come from stories or imagination. It came from experience, but Andrew's reaction was what unsettled me most. His fury had been too raw, too defensive. It wasn't the outrage of a man falsely accused. It was the rage of someone exposed. I sat at the edge of one of the benches, watching as Margaret tried to comfort Emily in a corner of the room. The little girl was holding a stuffed bear tightly against her chest, her small hands gripping it as if it were the only thing tethering her to safety. She's terrified of him, Margaret said softly, glancing over at me. Her voice was low, almost pleading. You saw it, didn't you? You believe her? I nodded, my jaw tight. I believe her. Margaret exhaled shakily, brushing a strand of gray hair from her face. She's been through so much already. Losing her mother, watching him come in and out of their lives like a storm. She doesn't deserve this. No, she doesn't. I agreed, my mind racing. I glanced over my shoulder at Andrew, who was seated across the room with his lawyer. He wasn't looking at Emily. He wasn't even pretending to care. Instead, he was leaning back in his chair, scrolling through his phone like this was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. Something about him set my teeth on edge. When the court reconvened, the tension in the room was palpable. Andrew walked back to his seat with an air of smug defiance, as if the entire ordeal were beneath him. Margaret held Emily's hand as they returned to their spot, her grip protective, almost desperate. Judge Stone entered, her face unreadable as she took her seat. She cleared her throat, and the murmurs in the gallery fell silent. Before we proceed, she began, I want to remind everyone that this court is a place for truth and fairness. Any further disruptions will not be tolerated. Her gaze lingered on Andrew for a moment before shifting to Emily. Emily, she said gently, thank you for being brave and sharing what you did earlier. I know that wasn't easy. Emily nodded slightly, but didn't say anything. The judge turned to Margaret. Ms. Lawson, I understand that you've been Emily's primary caregiver since her mother's passing. Do you have any evidence or testimony that could further clarify the claims made today? Margaret stood, her hands shaking as she clutched a folder to her chest. Yes, Your Honor, she said, her voice trembling. I've kept records of everything. Text messages, emails, photos, anything I could to protect Emily. She handed the folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. As Judge Stone began to flip through the pages, The room grew still. "There are photographs here," the judge said after a moment, her tone measured. "Images of injuries sustained by Emily's mother. Bruises, cuts, some of these are severe." Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Her name was Sarah," she said. "She was my daughter." She stayed silent for years, thinking she could handle it, thinking she could protect Emily. But she couldn't. Andrew slammed his hand on the table, causing everyone to jump. "This is slander," he roared. "Those pictures don't prove anything. Sarah was clumsy. She was always falling or getting hurt. You can't pin this on me." Judge Stone fixed him with a steely glare. "Mr. Walker, if you interrupt these proceedings again, I will hold you in contempt. Sit down." Andrew's lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but Andrew shrugged him off, sinking back into his chair with a scowl. The judge turned back to Margaret. "Do you have any further evidence?" Margaret hesitated, glancing at Emily. Then, slowly, she said yes. "There are journal entries. Sarah kept a diary. She wrote about everything, what he did to her, the threats he made, the time she thought he'd go too far." The courtroom fell silent again as the judge reviewed the diary entries. I could see the weight of the words pressing down on her, her face growing grimmer with each page she turned. "Your Honor," Andrew's lawyer interjected, breaking the silence. "With all due respect, these entries are hearsay. The court cannot verify their authenticity or use them as definitive proof." "That's true," Judge Stone said, her voice sharp. "However, combined with the photographs, Emily's testimony, and Mr. Walker's behavior in this courtroom, it paints a concerning picture." Andrew's face turned red. "This is a witch hunt," he shouted. "Enough," the judge snapped, slamming her gavel down. "Mr. Walker, you've already been warned. Bailiff, remove him from the courtroom." The bailiff approached Andrew, who stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. "This isn't over," he yelled as they escorted him toward the door. "You think you can take her away from me? I'll be back. The door slammed shut behind him, cutting off his threats. Emily flinched at the sound, curling into Margaret's side. My heart ached at the sight of her, so small and vulnerable, caught in the storm of this man's rage. Judge Stone let out a slow breath, her expression weary. "This case is far from resolved," she said. "But it's clear to me that Emily's safety must be our top priority." She turned to Margaret. "Ms. Lawson, I am granting you temporary custody of Emily while we conduct a more thorough investigation into these allegations." Margaret gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. She pulled Emily into her arms, holding her tightly as if she never wanted to let go. The relief in the room was palpable, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this wasn't over. Andrew's threats still hung heavy in the air, a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. As the courtroom emptied, I stayed behind, my thoughts racing. Margaret had won a small victory today, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Andrew wasn't finished. His anger, his defiance, it wasn't the kind of thing that disappeared quietly. And deep down, I knew that the fight to protect Emily was only just beginning. The temporary custody ruling should have brought a sense of relief, but the weight of Andrew's threats lingered like a storm cloud over all of us. I knew his type. Men who thrived on control, who couldn't stand to lose, especially when the stakes were public. Margaret had taken Emily home that evening, her grip on the girl's hand never loosening. I followed them out of the courthouse, offering to help with anything they might need. Margaret had looked exhausted, as if years of fear had finally caught up with her, but she managed a weak smile and nodded. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Andrew's outburst. His words weren't just bluster. They were a promise, and deep down, I knew he wouldn't let this go. The next morning, I called Margaret to check on her. "How's Emily?" I asked. "She's fine," Margaret replied, though her voice was strained. "She's sleeping now. Poor thing barely closed her eyes last night. Every little noise had her jumping out of bed." I clenched my fist, my frustration boiling over. "Margaret, you need to be careful. Andrew's not going to back down. He made that clear in court." "I know," she said softly. "But what can I do? The court gave me custody, and the police can't do anything until he actually does something. Until then, I just have to keep her close. Her words hung heavy in the air. She was right. Legally, there wasn't much anyone could do. But I wasn't willing to wait for Andrew to make his next move. I spent the next few days digging into Andrew's life. He wasn't just a man with a temper. He was a man with a past. I contacted an old friend who worked in law enforcement, asking for anything he could find on Andrew Walker. The results were unsettling. There were no convictions, but there were records, reports of domestic disturbances, accusations from previous relationships that had never gone anywhere, even a bar fight that had ended with the other man in the hospital. Andrew had a knack for walking away unscathed, leaving chaos in his wake. I couldn't let him do the same to Emily. A few days later, I visited Margaret and Emily at their small, cozy house. Margaret had tried to make the home as cheerful as possible. Bright curtains, framed pictures of her daughter on the walls, and toys scattered throughout the living room. But the atmosphere was heavy. Emily sat on the couch, clutching her stuffed bear and staring blankly at the television. She barely reacted when I walked in. "She hasn't been herself," Margaret said quietly, her eyes welling up with tears. "She's scared, but she doesn't want to talk about it." I don't know what to do. I sat down beside Emily, trying to meet her gaze. "Hey, kiddo," I said softly. "How are you holding up?" She didn't answer right away. Her fingers tightened around the bear, her knuckles turning white. Finally, she said, "Is he going to come here?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "No," I said firmly. "He's not going to hurt you. I promise." Later that evening, after Emily had gone to bed, Margaret and I sat in the kitchen, drinking coffee and talking in hushed voices. "I can't shake the feeling that he's watching us," Margaret admitted, her hands trembling as she clutched her mug. "I keep looking out the window, expecting to see his car parked down the street." "Have you seen anything?" I asked, my voice low. She shook her head. "Not yet. But that doesn't mean he's not out there." I placed a hand on her shoulder. "If he shows up, you call me. Anytime, day or night." "I mean it." Margaret nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes. That fear proved to be well-founded. 2 nights later, Margaret called me, her voice shaking. "He's here," she whispered. I froze. "Andrew? Are you sure?" "I saw his car," she said. "It's parked down the street. He's just sitting there, watching the house." My blood ran cold. "I'm on my way. Lock the doors and don't let him in. Call the police." I drove like a madman, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. When I arrived, Margaret was standing by the front window, her face pale and drawn. "There," she said, pointing toward the car parked across the street. It was Andrew's car, all right. He was sitting behind the wheel, his face illuminated by the glow of his phone. "Stay here," I told Margaret. "I'll handle this." I walked across the street, my heart pounding in my chest. Andrew saw me coming and rolled down his window, a smirk spreading across his face. "Evening," he said, his tone mocking. "What are you doing here, Andrew?" I demanded. "Just enjoying the view," he said, leaning back in his seat. "Is that a crime?" "You're harassing them," I said, my voice low and steady. "You need to leave." Andrew chuckled, the sound low and menacing. "Or what? You gonna call the cops?" "They can't do anything. I'm just sitting in my car." I stepped closer, leaning down so I was eye level with him. "If you care about that little girl at all, you'll stay the hell away from her. You've done enough damage." Andrew's smirk faded, and his eyes narrowed. "You think you can protect her?" he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous tone. "You think you can stop me? You're nothing. And neither is Margaret. That kid belongs to me, and I'll take her back when I damn well please." The cold fury in his voice sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't back down. "You're not going to get near her," I said. "Not as long as I'm around." Andrew stared at me for a long moment, then laughed, a dark, humorless sound. "We'll see about that," he said. And then he drove off, leaving me standing in the middle of the street with my fists clenched and my heart racing. Back inside, I told Margaret what had happened. She was shaking, her hands pressed to her mouth. "He's not going to stop, is he?" she whispered. I didn't have the heart to lie to her. "No," I said, "but we're not going to let him win." As I left the house that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that Andrew's threats were more than just words. The storm was coming, and it was only a matter of time before it hit. Andrew's threats hung over us like a storm cloud, and deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before he tried something. His ego wouldn't let him lose, not to Margaret, and certainly not to a little girl like Emily. I spent the next few days on edge, constantly checking in with Margaret and Emily, looking over my shoulder wherever I went. The police had been called the night he parked outside Margaret's house, but by the time they arrived, Andrew was already gone. They'd taken a report, of course, but it didn't amount to much. There's not much we can do unless he actually violates the custody order, one of the officers had said. The words echoed in my head, filling me with frustration and dread. But Andrew didn't need to violate in order to leave his mark. He knew exactly how to make people feel powerless. 2 nights later, Margaret called me again. This time her voice was different, panicked, frantic. "He broke into the house," she whispered, her voice trembling so badly I could barely understand her. "What?" I said, already grabbing my keys. "Where are you?" "Where's Emily?" "We're in the basement," she said. "I locked the door, but I think he's still upstairs." "Please, you have to come." "I'm on my way," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Stay where you are. Don't make a sound. I'm calling the police." I don't remember much about the drive to Margaret's house. Only the way my hands shook on the steering wheel and the sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. When I arrived, I parked down the street and approached the house cautiously. The front door was slightly ajar, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed from inside. I called the police again as I crept up the porch steps. "He's inside," I whispered into the phone. "The grandmother and child are in the basement. Send someone now." The operator assured me officers were en route, but I couldn't wait. Margaret and Emily needed me. I stepped inside the house, my heart pounding in my chest. The living room was dark, the furniture in disarray, as if someone had been searching for something. A faint creak of floorboards drew my attention to the kitchen, and I moved toward it as quietly as I could. Andrew was there, his back to me, rifling through drawers. He didn't see me at first, too consumed by whatever he was looking for. "Andrew," I said, my voice cold and steady. He froze, then turned slowly, a cruel smile spreading across his face. Well, he said. "Look who decided to show up." "Get out," I said, taking a step closer. "The police are on their way. You're done." Andrew laughed, a low, humorless sound. "You think you can stop me?" he said, taking a step toward me. "You think the police are going to do anything? This is my daughter. My blood. You don't get to take her away from me." "She's not yours," I said through clenched teeth. "You don't get to call yourself her father after everything you've done to her and Sarah." Andrew's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of anger. "You don't know anything," he said, his voice rising. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're just a pathetic busybody, sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." I didn't flinch, didn't back down. "The only thing pathetic here is you," I said. "You've spent your whole life bullying people smaller than you, and now you're picking on a 7-year-old girl. You're not a father, Andrew. You're a coward." His face turned red with rage, and for a moment, I thought he was going to lunge at me. But before he could move, the sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder as they approached the house. Andrew's head snapped toward the door, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. "They're here," I said, taking another step toward him. "It's over, Andrew." He hesitated, his fists clenched, but he didn't move. The flashing lights of the police cars lit up the windows, and moments later, officers stormed into the house, their weapons drawn. "Andrew Walker." One of them barked. "Put your hands up." Andrew's shoulders sagged, and he raised his hand slowly, his face a mask of defeat. The officers moved quickly, handcuffing him and leading him out of the house. As they passed me, Andrew glared at me one last time. "This isn't over," he snarled. "Yes, it is," I said, my voice calm. Once the house was secure, I rushed to the basement door and knocked gently. "Margaret, it's me," I said. "It's safe now. You can come out." The door creaked open, and Margaret emerged, holding Emily tightly against her chest. The little girl's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. But when she saw me, she broke into tears and ran into my arms. "It's okay," I said, holding her close. "You're safe now. He can't hurt you anymore." The days that followed were a blur of police reports and court hearings. Andrew was charged with breaking and entering, harassment, and violating the court's orders. With the new evidence against him, the judge permanently revoked his custody rights and issued a restraining order, ensuring he would never come near Emily or Margaret again. It wasn't just a legal victory. It was a victory for Emily, a chance for her to finally feel safe. Months later, I visited Margaret and Emily at their home. The house felt lighter now, filled with laughter and warmth. Emily had started smiling again, her eyes no longer shadowed by fear. As we sat in the backyard, watching Emily play with her dog, Margaret turned to me and said, "I don't know what we would have done without you. You saved her." I shook my head. "You saved her," I said. "You fought for her when no one else would." Margaret smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "We all did, and now she can finally have the life she deserves." Watching Emily run through the yard, her laughter ringing out like a melody, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. She was safe. She was free. And no one could take that from her ever again. And that's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed this journey, please give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this one. Got thoughts or experiences you'd like to share? Drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.